Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. My guest today is Barry Thatcher, professor and interim department head at the Department of English at New Mexico State University. Today's topic is writing across borders, multilingual and ESL writing. Professor Thatcher, welcome to Fronteras.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Let's start out by the program by discussing what writing across the border means and how important is multilingual writing.
Well, I've spent the last 13 years here at New Mexico State University, and for most of that time I've actually been doing my research in Ciudad Juarez or Chihuahua City, looking at the writing of Mexican nationals. And then I'm teaching here in Las Cruces, and I'm teaching writing in English. And I've realized that there's a lot of differences in the writing patterns between my Mexican nationals with whom I work in Ciudad Juarez, and a lot of the expectations that we place on students in our writing classrooms. And so even though we're on the border, there's not a lot of crossing the borders in terms of understanding of how writing works in various places, and so that's what border writing means.
Now, in the time that you've been spending, doing the research on this, what surprises you the most? What pops out at you that says, wow, I did not expect to see this? Because you'd say you've been doing this for about 13 years?
I've been on the border for 13 years. I've been researching this topic for about 20 years, and that includes 4 years in Ecuador, South America, where I researched the writing of Ecuadorians dealing with U.S. writing. What pops out to me is how misunderstood or how a lot of the cultural patterns and writing patterns that come from Mexico and Latin America, how those patterns get observed and evaluated in the writing classroom. They're often taken to be out of the norm or deficient or not as clear, not as understandable, and it continually surprises me here 45 minutes from the border that we really don't understand a lot of what I call the rhetorical traditions in Mexico. The forms of expression, we don't understand that well. That surprises me.
Now, when we're talking about this writing in particular, we're talking about collegiate, correct? Or what writing are we discussing?
That's a great question. I actually started this research in the workplace. When I was in Ecuador, I looked at how Ecuadorians received new policies and procedures written in English, but to be implemented in Ecuador. It was an accounting office, one of the big accounting firms, and so I studied across cultural writing in business. And when I came here in 2001 to the border, I studied the writing in the maquilas in Chihuahua City and in Ciudad Juarez, and I looked at how Mexican engineers and Mexican nationals actually took the U.S.-based policies, procedures, and instructions and interpreted them for their manufacturing processes. So while I was doing all that research, I noticed that the same writing patterns I saw in Mexico were showing up in the classroom by those very students who brought them in various ways to the writing classroom. And so now I'm working much more specifically on the writing patterns that show up in NMSU's writing classrooms in all their variations.
What are some U.S. and Mexican rhetorical traditions?
There's some interesting differences. If I had time, I would go back and narrate the history of writing in Mexico versus the history of writing in the United States. Very different histories based on, first of all, based on different legal systems. There's a civil law system in Mexico, there's a common law system in the United States. There's also huge differences in education, the economic system, but the Latin values, the Romantic Latin values, strongly encourage some writing patterns that are in many ways different from the U.S. I'll just give you a taste of some of the differences I've seen in business and in the workplace. What I would call a more Mexican rhetorical or writing form of expression would be really sensitivity to authority and a sensitivity to roles and who's in charge and how the roles position you for what you communicate. And often you're speaking to groups. Often in the United States, we're assuming more egalitarianism in writing, and because of that, we tend to want to be agonistic, which means we're arguing for a thesis and we want to make a statement, and we have this strong burden of argument. There's another way sometimes, well, I teach a class, a sophomore writing class to all Mexican nationals, and they live in Chihuahua City. And one of the other difficulties that Mexican nationals have when they're writing in our situation is parallelism and organization. And I finally came up with a metaphor to help them. I asked them, what is it like to drive in Chihuahua City? Is it parallel? How organized is it compared to driving in Las Cruces? And then they realized that the U.S., we have values. We want writing parallel, topic sentence, coherence, organized, point by point by point. And so that traffic example tends to really make sense to them. And that also has something to do with directness. Often a Mexican pattern is to announce a topic and then, kind of like traffic, artfully maneuver your way through the essay. And that kind of digression, as U.S. instructors would call it, doesn't play very well in the U.S. writing classroom.
In your study, you found that 20% of instructors could distinguish a Mexican national student from a Mexican monolingual who has lived multiple generations in the United States. How important is it to make that distinction?
This is one of the things that's really important to make, that your looks, the way a student looks, has absolutely nothing to do, the genetic features absolutely has nothing to do with the rhetorical and cultural values they bring to the classroom. Many who are new to this area think that because you look so-called Mexican, whatever that means, that you're going to bring those Mexican rhetorical patterns. But there are many who lived here before it was the United States who embrace and are fully English sufficient and who have no Mexican writing rhetorical backgrounds, patterns to them. And professors don't understand it's not the looks, it's the cultural, social history that the student brings. And so we're not doing a very good job. 20% of instructors can't tell between a Mexican national who just came from Mexico and a Mexican American of fourth generation. That to me is astounding.
What role does assimilation play in that?
This is interesting. When I teach my class of all Mexican nationals, we talk about this, and I like to think of it in terms of bilingual, that I'm teaching you the American system so that you can choose to use it when you think it's best suited and ethically to do so. So there's an assimilation, but it's based on choice, and it's based on what they want to do with their lives. And we joke about it because we joke about making them agringado, as we say, gringoized, making them more direct. We joke about that. And some Mexican nationals in my class have said, you know what, I'm already direct. My family's direct, my family's a little more that way, I'm okay with it. And some look at me and go, I can never write as directly as you're going to want me to in the United States. And so assimilation is a tough question, but I like it to put it back to the choices and the values of the individual and what that individual wants to do. Well, we like to denaturalize it, we call it, make those patterns a choice.
What about ethnocentrism? What role does it play in multilingual and ESL studies?
That's a long topic. If you talk to a good number of people here who spoke Spanish as a first language, and they're maybe 50, 60 years old, you realize that Spanish was beat out of them in grade school, that they were whipped or it was beat out of them. That's ethnocentrism. But what's also ethnocentrism is here at the U.S. University, where we're not beating Spanish out of people, but we're beating those forms of expression that come from Mexico, and because we don't understand them, we think they're unnatural, and we expect the U.S. way to be the right way or natural way. That's ethnocentrism. And so I like to say, where do the writing patterns from the United States come from? Why do we have them? Vice versa, Mexico, and say, well, this is what we have based on these histories, and let's work with both of them.
Well, what role does, how does border culture affect multilingual and ESL? As we look, we've got the border here between, Las Cruces, and we've got Juarez. And then, of course, you've got past Juarez, you've got Chihuahua City and all of that. I mean, what role do we see with that in ESL writing and multilingual?
This is a really complex role, and this is much more complex than most people understand. Most people think the border is this third space. And this is a very hot topic in U.S. academia. And there's some notable theorists such as Ansaldúa who talk about the third space. The problem with that is it ignores the border and the border's relevance. The border is relevant in many ways. You cross the border into Mexico, you're under Mexican legal jurisdiction, you're under Mexico's economic system, you're under a whole bunch of things that radically change. I know because I teach there. But at the same time, there's this crossing, this continuous crossing of some kinds of values. So the border to me means that some of the Mexican rhetorical traditions cross the United States really easily, and vice versa. We see a strong U.S. presence in Ciudad Juarez. Some don't cross very much at all, and some cross and are changed just because of the border. So the border here has that complexity. I've actually teased out, and this is based on some research and theory called the human capability approach. I've looked at 5 or 6 kinds of groups we have on the border instead of just 2. We tend to think of Mexican, Mexican American, and Anglo. But I've teased out, based on some of my own work and research, where a Mexican American who's, as I mentioned, who's lived here 4 generations is very different than a Mexican national. But then we have this group called Generation 1-5 children. This is a linguistic term. These are children who are born to Mexican parents, but born here, and they're caught between generations. And then we have what's called a recent immigrant who comes here as an adult. And then there's a bicultural population that remains kind of hidden. And I only know about this bicultural population because I do so much work in Ciudad Juarez. And when I try to get people to work with me, first thing I say, do you speak Spanish? No, then they can't work in Mexico. Will you go to Juarez? Yes, I have family there and I go all the time. Then I'm going, there's a bicultural element. So there's groups that we don't really understand very well that have very different rhetorical strategies to them.
What kind of support currently exists in the United States universities for foreign students, especially as applied to writing and ESL?
This is an interesting question. My research, and graduate students have done similar research, the closer we get to the Mexico border, the worse the support is for ESL Spanish-speaking students. It's a large claim, it's true. Our ESL, right now, actually in our faculty meeting today in the English department, we talked about taking on the ESL courses. The ESL courses have been they've had a speech communication disorder prefix. And we can think about the rhetorical identity of having to take a speech disorder class because you're an ESL speaker. So the ESL program here, it's had wonderful people, but it hasn't been funded well. The more you get outside of the border, the more you get outside of large urban areas, the more, paradoxically, the more support there is. And this is well researched throughout.
Well, let's look back
Yes.
10 years ago, or maybe even 20 years ago, to where the programs were. I mean, what's changed, what hasn't changed, or is it still operating as though it were 25 years ago, 20 years ago?
This is a surprising thing, you know. It's just been in the last 2 or 3 years here in our English department, where our English department, Patty Wojan and I and several others have, we began work with the ESL people. And it hasn't even had an ESL department, it's been a speech communication. So it's only been in the last 3 years. If you look at what's going on in UTEP, they have a really good ESL, but what's going on in the English department has very little ESL influence. So nothing has really changed in the last 25 years on this issue. It's been hidden, and it's been hidden for a lot of reasons. One of the main reasons is the people running the writing programs don't have experience in Mexico. There's a big difference. If you live in El Paso all your life, but never work on an equal basis with Mexican nationals, you'll never get the differences. If the Mexican national is always in a subordinate position, he or she will tell you what you want to hear. So that's part of the reason why things have been hidden here for a long time.
How does this change as we move away from the border, away from the border? And again, my question that comes to mind is, okay, so let's say we've got a pretty broad border. We've got from Texas all the way to California. We're experiencing New Mexico. How is it different in Texas versus California and New Mexico and Arizona?
It's interesting. If we look just at the writing programs, this means these are the first year, second year composition writing programs at U.S. universities. it doesn't change much. Some of the universities right on the border in Texas, for example, there's one at Pan American. Some of the smaller, more satellite universities have a really strong Mexican American, Latino staff that are starting to address these problems because of the student population is 95% plus. So some of it's starting in a small way, but if you look at San Diego State, you look at University of Arizona, and if you look at how they teach the writing classes, they haven't addressed it systematically in their writing classes either.
What writing strategies are brought to the table, by students that can be helpful in future, developing future curriculum? Again, as we look 25 years ago, what can be done to improve on this?
Well, I envision a bicultural community. I first of all envision a bilingual. This is kind of my grand, great goal for this area. That we understand, first of all, that the American writing patterns and traditions are actually not that common in other places around the world. So when we understand how to accommodate and work with the Mexican national writing patterns, and what we call is we denaturalize, we show where those students are coming from, that really prepares students for the global marketplace because they understand themselves better. It's like the cliche is true, the only way to really know yourself is to live in another country, and that denaturalizes all of your behaviors. We want to do the same thing with writing.
In your report, you write about that a problem or challenge about studying writing along the border is denial and re-entrenching. Could you explain that?
Yes, I think I talked about that earlier, that the closer we get to the border, the more we want to believe it's not there. And a classic example, and I don't know the history of that, but if you look at UTEP, it has Tibetan or Nepalese architecture. And that really surprises people because they're going to think it's right, the border's right there. Why doesn't it look like it's from Mexico? Well, that's an interesting instance. The closer you get to the border, the more you re-entrench your own values. And this idea of re-entrenchment comes out of cross-cultural organizational behavior. For example, I did some work in IBM del Ecuador, or IBM from Ecuador. And we would think that an IBM branch in Ecuador would have a really strong Ecuadorian flavor to it. But it was actually more Americanized because it was continually facing what they thought was the Ecuadorian cultural system. And so it was more American because of that. NMSU, in some ways, is more American than UNM or University of Iowa because of this constant facing and denial of the border. That's a theory. Some of it works well. Some of it we're still working out.
How does it work with students that are not from Mexico, that might come from El Salvador, from Central America, because again, that population has grown as well. How does it work for ESL and for writing?
Well, this is the interesting thing that we're really working on in the English department. If you have a visa, if you have a visa, doesn't matter where you come from, you have to take the writing class in the Speech Communication Department's SPCD 111. It's now in border programs. But you could have someone who's bilingual, who lives in Ciudad Juarez, bilingual English, taking a course with someone from Hong Kong who's just learning English. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to assess students' language capabilities not based on where their visa, but on their actual capabilities. So we might get some bilingual Juarenses in our native classes, and we might send some Spanish dominant Americans to the ESL courses. And I think I answered your question that way.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. What kind of support do you get from Mexican universities as far as, in developing the program and, working with them? What kind of support do they offer, and, what can you learn from them?
Well, writing is not taught in Mexico the way it's taught here.
Okay.
If writing is taught at all, and it's not taught nearly as much, it's taught in either journalism departments or in literature courses. So my colleagues, I have some really good colleagues in Ciudad Juarez, I have some great colleagues in Mexico City, and actually some rhetoric programs. the way they support us is doing their research on the history and practice of writing in Mexico, so we better understand where they come from. I have a really good colleague in Ciudad Juarez who is a professor at UACJ and is a professor at Colegio de Chihuahua, and he is adamant about making sure that his graduate students write well. He's published his own books in writing, and we share war stories frequently. But in that sense, the U.S. has more writing programs, but Mexico and the Mexican programs come out of different departments.
What is the future of multilingual writing, and how are U.S. universities prepared for this, or are they?
It's interesting. Some are, some aren't. We did a study. I had a graduate student do a study. She looked at the university websites for international students, and she found that the further away you are from the border again, the more you're going to put your university subpage or web page in a variety of languages, the more you're going to support what they do. But the closer you got to the border, the closer you came to a large urban area that's already multilingual, the more they just said, maybe they throw up their hands and say, we can't accommodate everyone. So we're at that moment now where those rural, Midwestern, kind of central universities are really embracing this and really interested in it. Others aren't.
Well, I mean, speaking of some of these universities, I mean, how have they improved on this, you know, and what can be learned by some of our border universities to take some of that curriculum and bring it here?
Well, what they have done, and there's a whole field of study called second language writing or ESL writing, and they study how students from other countries write in English. So we study it here, and there's other programs and other names of how students who live in China are writing English in China, and English for specific purposes. So this is a global phenomena. But the United States, not surprisingly, is really far behind the rest of the world on really understanding multilingual writing. And when I talk about multilingual writing, I'm not talking about this. I'm not talking about everyone get in a writing classroom and showing how unique you are. I'm talking about understanding someone from another country, another culture who might have radically different perceptions about what good writing is, and how we understand and embrace that, not to make everything relative, but to make it strategic. For example, and this is an interesting strategic thing, one of the writing patterns of Mexican nationals is sensitivity to authority and role-based. Now, in certain circumstances, that's a strength, wherever you live. One of the strengths of American writing patterns is this kind of one-on-one, a little bit aggressive, we call it agonistic, thesis-based. That's a certain strength in some circumstances. And so we try to, in some ways, take those patterns out of their cultural context and say, you know what, we're going to use what we put in quotes, a so-called Mexican pattern here, because this is what is most effective with our audience and most ethical with what we're trying to do.
Let's give you a blank canvas and some paintbrushes. What would you paint for the future of multilingual writing and ESL that where you would see it like being where it needs to be? If you had a 5 or 10-year program, what would you do?
What we're actually working on today in the English department, the 5-year program would be we bring the ESL into the English department, which we're close to that, I think. And that we have a variety of courses for the range of students' ESL and American knowledge and capacity, or knowledge of American cultural patterns and capacity. And we give students options. Some Mexican nationals, for example, want to be with native speakers. They don't want to be with someone from Hong Kong because they want kind of native speaker feedback. We've also learned that some Americans are interested in other countries. So we're thinking of creating what's called, creating a course where we have second language writers of English with native writers of English who are interested in multicultural writing, and they can work with each other. So that's a really interesting course that we would want to do. I also want to work really hard on the writing of our graduate students from other countries. There is a tremendous need for graduate students learning to write academic English from other countries, and we don't address that at all. So we're trying to develop coursework in the English department, but maybe some workshops in Teaching Academy where we work with professors in the sciences, social sciences and health and business, so that they can help their graduate students write an argument that works with the American rhetorical system.
In closing, what can be done immediately to help improve things? I mean, again, we've talked about the past, we've talked about the future, but just in closing, what can be done today to help improve ESL and multilingual writing?
I think I want to go back to the study we did that only 20% of the instructors in writing departments in this area could tell the difference between a Mexican national who just came and someone who's lived here for 4 or 5 generations. The first thing we could do would be to say, you know what, those people bring very different strategies. I think we think of the border as you're either Chicano, Anglo, you're either Mexican-American, Anglo. And a Mexican-American and a Mexican national, even a Generation 1-5, I think making those, understanding where those people and students come from is what we can do right now.
Well, Professor Barry Thatcher, professor and interim department head at the Department of English at New Mexico State University, thank you very much for coming in here on Fronteras, A Changing America, and thank you for watching.
You're welcome. Thank you.